So our next panel discussion is revolved around the road to COP28. We will be focusing on the energy transition and the key factors for successful implementation in the region and how the UAE can prepare for a more successful and action-oriented outcome at COP28. I would like to welcome to the stage the moderator of this panel, Dr. Nasser Saidi, the founder and chairman of the Clean Energy Business Council. Also, I would like to welcome the panelists, Laila Abdullatif, Director General of Emirates Nature-WWF, Samir Al-Shihabi, Head of Energy Transition Partnership at COP28 UAE, Ibrahim Ghosn, Senior Vice President of Operations at Enova, Dr. Nayrouz Badr, CEO of the Envision Partnership, and Denise Korchnov, Regional Energy Specialist at the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP.
That was deliberate. This, by far, is probably the most important panel of the day. Not because only of the panel that we have, but we need to realize when the Conference of the Parties got together in 2015 in Paris, they were signaling something about an existential threat to humanity. We're now several years since then. We've just had COP27. We're now looking forward to COP28. But anyone who has lived through the past 2 years, whether it's from the pandemics or to all the danger signals of climate change, coming from melting ice caps to hurricanes, to changes in the weather systems, all of that is signaling something very important, that we may very well be reaching tipping points. We don't know anything about that because our history as humans is very limited on this earth. Earth, of course, has been around much longer and has seen cycles and climate change. But Gaia, Earth, has always protected itself. We go through cycles, and they change, and it comes back. But today, we're living into what some scientists call the Anthropocene age, where human beings are changing nature. And it could be changed irremediably. In other words, we might be getting to a point where the changes cannot be reversed. So COP28 really is meant to focus our minds on something which has to do with our existence on Earth. So everything that we've talked about today, whether it's hydrogen, climate finance, mobility, etc., all of that comes together when the Conference of the Parties meet. And I think what I'd like to hear from our panelists is to start addressing the seriousness of the nature of what humanity is facing. And the other point is that when we talk about the Conference of the Parties, I always like to remind people that the human animal is not the only animal around. There are non-human animals. There is nature. There is everything that surrounds us, the biosystem. And that biosystem and those animals, the non-human animals, are not represented in the Conference of the Parties. Nobody gives voice to the animals. Somebody has to. There's also no voice given to the future generations. When we make calculations on feasibilities and cost-benefit analysis of various projects, we typically discount the future. And when the future is far enough, something that might happen in 10, 15 years, if you discount it at 5%, doesn't look like a lot. So we tend to forget about it. We should not be discounting. There should be a zero discount rate when it comes to addressing climate change. And I mention that because we're all very content with coming out with net zero emissions targets. And that's going to by 2050 and by 2060. Inshallah, a lot of you will be around in 2050, 2060. But that's, 30, 40 years from now. Many of us will not be around. And in particular, the politicians who make those commitments have very, very short political lifetimes. They're looking ahead for the next year, or even the next quarter, or the next 2, 3, 4 years at best. They're not going to be around when the time has come for accountability of the net zero emissions. So how do we make future governments accountable? What will future generations say about us? I think that is what we need to worry about. So we brought together a really distinguished panel. It's private sector plus public sector plus you name it. I think we've got it represented. So I'm going to start off first with Samir, because COP28, if you look at the major themes, are about energy, adaptation, inclusiveness, and global stocktaking. So those are the main themes. So let me start off with Samir. We mentioned COP28. So it aims to be action-oriented. So what does this mean from your point of view? You're looking at the energy transition partnerships, the regional energy sector, and how do we mobilize required action? So I'd like each of our panelists to take a few minutes first, and then we'll interact. And then I'll open it up for questions. Please.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Doctor. My name is Samir Shahabi. I'm very happy to be here, and we appreciate you sticking around to hear what we want to talk about, and welcome your feedback. Your opening remarks, Doctor, are very pertinent, and the theme and the spirit of what you're describing is very much embedded and driven within the COP28 organization and in the leadership. We know this is the COP that needs to happen to change the direction of where things are going. You mentioned the global stocktake, and that is a key milestone for this year. All indications, irrespective of the details, are such that we're not on track. And as such, our focus isn't 2050. This COP28 is about 2030. What can be done to redirect, to re-engage, to reboot, to get 2030 to be a good milestone for us to work towards. So to that end, we are committed to Paris. We are committed to the 1.5 degree commitment, and we have 5 major pillars that we're working with. And then I'll address the energy transition a little bit more specifically. The 5 pillars are, as you all know, mitigation. The first one, we're committed doubling down to 1.5. And what needs to be done to maintain that course or to redirect towards that course. Number 2, on adaptation. We're committed to the global goal on adaptation. And how do we increase public and private financing to decarbonize the energy systems to allow for that to continue, or to, again, retrack to be able to happen. Number 3, loss and damage. This is the, let's say, the most current of the new objectives. We want to operationalize a fund to be able to maintain climate security and deal with the loss and damage issues that the world is discussing. Overall, finance is our 4th key pillar. We want to work on reforms that will unlock private and public financing to ensure that all the projects that need to get financed can be financed. And 5th, and also still very, very important, particularly for this COP and our presidency, is how do we work with the private sector? We want this to be, as you said, an action-based, actionable COP. And that can only happen with the private sector. So everything that we're working on in the back of our mind is also about how do we get the private sector involved, to listen to the private sector, and I can have more remarks on that a little bit later. With respect to the energy transition, which is my particular focus, we have three major areas that we're working towards. Number one, energy efficiency and hard-to-abate sectors. What needs to be done for them to be able to contribute to the emission reductions that are required to get us back on track? Number two is energy decarbonization, and that goes across all energy sources. We're going to be very active and engaged from everywhere from nuclear to solar to all the renewables, and yes, even oil and gas. We're not shying away from oil and gas. That's an important element of our pillar, and we're going to work to find a way to make that an important element in the energy transition. And then finally, the third major is, like I mentioned, the renewable, and we want to scale up renewables, not just in kilowatt hours, but as a percentage of the energy mix, to actually offset some of the other energy sources to ensure that going forward, we get to a net zero energy system. So with that, that kind of gives you the overall approach we're taking. Obviously, there's a lot of detail, a lot of work. We are still quite in the early stages, but you'll start seeing a lot more activity in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you. I just want to remind everybody, of course, that the rest of the world is worrying about reaching 1.5 degrees extra. We're already beyond that in this part of the world. We've gone beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures. That's already happened in our part of the world. But second, I want to build a little bit, Samir, on what you were saying. How do we, at the moment, we're just talking about maybe 1 trillion worth of investments. We should be talking about 3 to 5 trillion if we really want to reach those goals that we're talking about. Is COP28 going to be talking about that?
Absolutely. We have a full dedicated team focused on the financing issues that everybody is facing. Everything from private sector, financing, multilateral development bank, reforms, the role of subsidies, government engagements. So finance, if you notice the 5 pillars, there was probably the word finance in every one of them. And so we understand and we know that is one of the impediments to getting us back on track. And there's a large focus, there's a strong initiative to push on how we unlock the financing to ensure that the projects that are ready to roll, that need that financing, can find it one way or the other. So we're working on a variety of ideas that will ultimately be presented to the global community.
Right, thank you. Laila, we've already discussed Emirates Nature, and we're privileged really this year. I mean, it's one of the things that makes me optimistic that COP28 is happening in the Emirates. Which was one of the few countries in the world, if not the only country, that actually has a minister for climate change. And to my mind, we should forget about net zero emissions targets. We need to think of encouraging all countries to have climate strategies, i.e. something that is all-encompassing, right? So at COP28, there's supposed to be a global stocktaking. Okay. So how do you think that could stimulate progress about mitigation, adaptation, and implementation? And how are you going to be participating in that?
Thank you. Hello. Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for having me here as well today. I think our role as an NGO, as a civil society entity is very different. It's about ensuring that the voices of everyone is heard, the voices of members that aren't usually heard, whether it's our youth, our other civil society entities, and our nature, and our priorities across the board.
And non-human animals.
And non-human animals.
That's what WWF is about now.
Exactly. And so the role that we play is twofold. I think one, my colleague Marina had highlighted, we're trying to play a very particular role in driving non-state actor implementation with regards to decarbonizing their own industries and creating models as well that can be replicated around the world. And that will support the efforts that will be held under the global Stocktake. But the other role that we have as well is more on the nature front, and how do we integrate nature-based solutions within the dialogues and ensure that that is also factored in as a key route for supporting our targets in the long run. Now, with regards to the global Stocktake, I believe COP28 will really set a new precedent for this, because it will be the first time that collectively the world is looking at how are we working towards our ambitions with the Paris Agreement? How far off are we? I think my fellow panelists already had highlighted that we are definitely way off with regards to climate mitigation, with regards to our climate finance, our adaptation measures, and so forth. But it will give us an opportunity to really look at the science and understand for the first time, how far off are we? What corrective measures do we need to put in place? And how can we reopen the dialogue in a very transparent and honest way to say, this is what we need to be able to reach the targets that we're aiming for. So I do think it's quite a big role for the COP28 presidency to lead that. As a science-based NGO, our role in supporting that is, again, bringing out the science where we can, as WWF locally, but also internationally. And then being a part of those dialogues to identify those innovative solutions to continue to enhance those policies and mechanisms for us to get closer to our targets, if you will. But we also need to have a dialogue then on what does it mean post-2030? What are our ambitions looking like post-2030 as well? And how can we put in place further measures to support our targets from a climate finance perspective and beyond. So I think it will be a very eye-opening experience for all of us in the room here, but also globally. And we'll learn a lot from it along the way as well. There's a lot of expectations on the UAE, but I do believe that we have a strong team in place as well to drive this moving forward.
Okay, now one thing we do know is we have not kept up with our targets. We are underinvesting, we're underfinancing. So we're going to do a stocktake, a global stocktake. And it's sort of like looking at the balance sheet, right? And we're going to say, hey, we're missing out very badly. You're going to be, as an NGO, discussing this. But a question, how do we make governments and organizations accountable for missing out? What are we going to do about accountability?
That's a very good question, and I think that's where we need to ensure that the process as well that's held in the UAE for COP28 is a very inclusive process. Because with inclusivity, we ensure accountability and credibility. And I believe that the COP28 presidency is pushing the inclusivity agenda quite strongly, not only from the corporate sector, from the youth, from civil societies and NGOs. And that is really a very strong foundation to begin with. Because it can't just be about governments highlighting where they stand. It's about ensuring that the dialogue is open for all. And everybody has a voice that's heard in that process. And also has a voice in terms of highlighting the innovative solutions that they bring to the table. Because as we know, the responsibilities lie across the board.
Okay, so NGOs, civil society have an important role to play, and of course the private sector. So let me bring in Ibrahim at this stage. So you're in charge of operations in Enova. It's a major player. So what are some of the initiatives happening in the UAE and the region that help us towards sustainability, driving climate change and climate change risk mitigation? And what are you doing about it? So what's the private sector doing about it?
Yes. So I'll split the question into two. If I want to refer to the presentation before the launch of Majid, he showed us a very interesting number on the achievements of what the UAE has done on the energy and water consumption reduction. And this has given a proven track record that UAE has contributed a lot And they were first to ratify the Paris Agreement and set the 2050 global goal for net zero achievement. I was attending the 10 days ago the World Future Energy Summit, and I was really attracted by the opening speech of Dr. Sultan, when he said that we're doing a lot, but we're still behind. So we need to act immediately. And it is the responsibility of everyone, not only the public sector, but the private sector. So if I want to step back a little bit and see how the UAE has contributed, there are many things, but I can remember few things that are remarkable. Look at Masdar City, for example. Masdar City, a sustainable city, first to implement sustainable solutions. Look at the Expo 2020. The Expo 2020 is hosting right now the COP28, but the Expo City has been built with themes of sustainability, mobility, and opportunity, and it has a message to the world that this is how we're going to build the future. Look at the Terra Pavilion, for example, hosting around 5,000 solar panels. It's generating around 4 gigawatt of electricity. Look also at the smart use of water, where they are recirculating the gray water and using it to irrigate almost 75% of the landscape area of Expo. And there is an important part which related to our business, which is the creation of the ESCO model, and the super ESCOs in the region, where first has been created in UAE with Etihad ESCO, ADES, and Adwiya, and we are proud that we are contributing a lot in this. So not only in UAE, but also if you look at Saudi Arabia, where they have Tarshid also is contributing a lot on the retrofitting concept of buildings for the government, and extending their hands also to the government sector, to the private sector. So I'm sure on the COP28, as we said, it's going to be a global stocktake of what has been done, and I'm sure that for the future is going to be really drawing the targets. So that is the first part of the initiatives. But from a global, from Enova perspective, we are an energy and facilities management services company. And we always considered ourselves that not the traditional FM approach, because the buildings are contributing a lot in the energy consumption. And if you look at integrating the energy with the facilities management, we can reach a lot of savings. And the concept of retrofitting is not only to invest and do the savings. You can always approach your projects into zero capex, where you can do some adjustments on your operation, and in this way you can reach, for example, for Majid Al-Futtaim malls, we were able to reduce 8 to 10% just from zero capex, and we have increased that through retrofitting and doing some adjustments, so on a short term and a long term. So if we look at the numbers that we have saved so far, we're talking about 420,000 tons of CO2 reduced throughout the years. We have saved almost 530 millions of kilowatt hour from energy reduction, which is equivalent to 370 million dirhams of savings. So the private sector is contributing. When we talk about the service provision, it is essential for us to contribute in that.
Good. I think we'll come back a little bit on the role of the private sector, because as we just talked, when we're talking about hydrogen, you need PPP. I mean, if we're going to be addressing climate change and its risks, you need both state actors and private actors to be together. So PPP is part of the solution. And when we get to that, and then I'd like to turn to Nairu, who's here on this. I'm cognizant of the fact that we have startups in the region that are looking at climate tech, that are beginning to be ESCOs, that are looking at waste to energy, all sorts of things happening. What are we doing really to encourage and support entrepreneurs, startups, and others in addressing many of these issues, and climate tech, and what should we be doing about it? How do we go about it? I mean, you deal a lot with entrepreneurs and leadership, so what is it that we should be doing?
Thank you.
And of course, they'll tell them, please just pay me a check and I'll go about it. We know that, but I think we need to dig deeper.
Absolutely, and that's why, I'll be tackling this topic more from not just the business imperative right decision to do, but it is the smart thing to do. And we have seen specifically post-COVID with attrition challenges globally, but more so I would say when it comes to clean energy specifically, that the new type of leadership and talent are very much purpose-driven. And it's extremely important in terms of employer branding, how we can attract the leaders that we want to draw, if you will, the new picture and do that kind of shift. And here where I say that the picture, with all the challenges that we have, but the good news for the new startups and SMEs, that you have the luxury of drawing the culture the way that you want to draw it. So from the beginning, you can start by emphasizing on the right message about that. And we see within the energy sector 3 themes that companies can do in the coming year and the years to come. The first one is to focus on the shift in terms of operational models, talent and leadership, of course, the key, and portfolio shift. So attracting, retaining, and retraining, I would say, talent for the new era is extremely important. As we see in terms of challenges, we have an additional challenge here, which is the aging workforce. Skill gaps in terms of engineering expertise, renewable, specifically in renewable and digitalization. So, what we have found, one of the examples that really worked well globally, and we'd like also to implement it here, is the collaboration with organizations in terms of to work together, tackling the engineering expertise and taking some ownership with smaller teams within the organization and helping them in terms of the leadership. So we found when there was accountability and ownership in terms of driving this agenda internally from within the team, that had accelerated actually the success. And we had a case study with an organization, utility organization in the States, where we were able to attract over 40 leadership roles in 1/3 of the time that usually it takes, simply because we had that, to some extent, internal competition, but within certain teams to take ownership within that element. So that have really turned to become a very successful. So I would say, taking ownership, mindset shift in terms of what used to work in the past, what type of leadership we used to have, is totally different than what we need for the future. And specifically, touching on what you've mentioned, Dr. Nasr, at the beginning, 10 years vision is really short in terms of being able to achieve the ambitious goal that we have. And this is where we need, the focus to start today or maybe yesterday, like what we were touching on earlier, to be able to accelerate the potential of achieving these goals.
Now, you work a lot with companies and entrepreneurs and leadership within that context. Question, how seriously do they take ESG? We heard this morning in terms of the panel that certainly the banking and financial sector, because it's highly regulated, is being sent a message, you have to take ESG seriously, and you have to price climate risk and all the rest. So that may be partially happening there. But what about the non-banking and non-financial sector? Are they incorporating ESG in terms of their activities and how they run their businesses?
Can I be honest?
Of course.
The environment is really mixed. There is the aspiration and the challenge in terms of implementation. There is the vision and dream versus the short term in terms of P&L. And that's why, when I started, I said that there are countless studies that shows if you implement ESG, it does reflect on a healthier P&L. So it's not just a CSR mission. It's purely a business mission. Now, how serious organizations are doing it, I would say in the last 18 months, we started to see that there is a more focus in terms of any role actually that we're working with on any organization. We're starting to have one of the extremely important competency to measure is sustainability, and how much the individuals are focused on this, and how the organization have the right environment to be inclusive of such a new leadership type. So I can't say that we have nothing, but of course we have a long way to go. And the more we can have kind of a push from PPP, policymakers, implementation in terms of, in general, I don't like quotas and numbers, but I see it that it is the right tool to be able to incentivize organizations to really take these missions seriously.
Right, thank you. Dennis, you represent UNDP on this panel. You're a regional energy specialist for UNDP. What sort of challenges, what are the regional challenges facing us on the road to COP28? If you had to highlight maybe 2 or 3 areas, what would they be?
Thank you very much, Dr. Nasser. I mean, the burden of being the last speaker in the last panel, that everything has been said before, or most of the things. I would like to thank a colleague from UNFCCC from the finance session this morning that highlighted example of Article 6 and the partnership between Ghana and Switzerland. This is basically the practical implementation of Article 6, which is on climate change mitigation, which is also additional opportunity for private sector. But coming back to the region, I think one thing that left behind in terms of inclusivity that I would like to highlight during my short intervention, that of course MENA region is not only about GCC countries. And if you recall Dr. Nasser's presentation this morning, he highlighted some of the challenges in other countries. And of course, there are various challenges. First of all, in terms of SDG 7, and achievement of SDG 7, there are around 60 million people in the region who don't have access to electricity. That's the baseline. In terms of acceleration of energy transition and green energy transition, of course the region is highly dependent on fossil fuels, plus there is a big issue or big burden of subsidies that prevent from moving forward with the renewables. Of course, in terms of the last decade, when it comes to the renewable energy progress in the region, we saw the growth like tenfold. For the banks, that means 1,000% over the last decade. The plans between 2020 and 2025 is to double it. For distribution companies, that's 10 times problems because they have to balance it in their grid. But I mean, in terms of approaching COP, of course, many challenges, low awareness in terms of the population about the climate risks. And climate risks, I mean, floods and droughts, they don't require visa on arrival. And they do cause displacement, internal displacement, plus external, which means refugees. And of course, when we talk about internal displacement and refugees, that is also the consequent impact, there will be consequent impact on the infrastructure, energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, as they tend to move towards cities. Lebanon is one example that has been impacted, the country has been impacted by Syrian refugees and, of course, from other countries as well. And basically, a few years ago, UNDP had to make an intervention there to include energy as part of building resilience in the national plans. So that was a critical element. Of course, in terms of the countries impacted by protracted crisis like Syria, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Palestine. So that's another side of the region. And again, it's not only about, I mean, I'm absolutely fascinated to hear about net zero targets in the GCC countries, and that's the way to go for sure. That's basically the North Star. But there is also another side of the coin, as the region is absolutely not homogeneous when it comes to equalities. I mean, excuse me. Just one example on, and this is food for thought, how conflict in Yemen basically accelerated the renewable energy transition and the market itself. Back in 2016, with the onset of crisis in Yemen, if you look at the statistic, the spike of renewable energy in Yemen, I mean in terms of installed renewable energy capacities, outpaced some of the Gulf countries. Unfortunately, that's because of the crisis. Because technology, due to fragmented grid, and those communities who only had access to electricity through the main grid, due to fragmented grid, technology, renewable energy technology becomes the only technology of choice. So the choice is simple here. In terms of, again, approaching COP, we do have some examples in the region of countries that did not even submit NDCs yet. That's, again, very unfortunate, and it's not because it's a least developed country or something. I mean, there are much bigger and deeper issues, but, and also, of course, as a result, the potential for renewable energy in that country, it's just untapped. So that it's a massive market for the private sector that several big and small players wish to accept. But again, when it comes to the policy level, the government does not allow PPA or feed-in tariff is not in place yet, unfortunately. Although the country has one of the highest solar radiation levels in the world. So that's, that's my
so
first
you pointed to the fact that among all the divides that we have, a digital divide, an income divide, a wealth divide, there's also access to technology and to dealing with climate risk across our region. And so we have the GCC countries which are privileged, which are able to address climate change and take climate action. And we have all the others, maybe, who are not able to. So very quickly, I want to turn to Samir. How are we going to be addressing that? Already we've seen in past COPs, COP27 and others, the developing countries or the less developed countries, including those countries that came late in the development stage, are saying, look, you developed countries are responsible for much of the climate disasters that we're now living, the pollution and everything else. You're now telling us, stop using fossil fuels, stop using a lot of energy, because that's contributing to climate change. And so China and India and everybody else is saying, well, no, thank you very much. You're now trying to constrain our economic development. So how is COP28 going to be facing up to that? And we tried to get some commitments from so-called advanced economies in COP27. There was a slight commitment to help countries with a few million or a few billion dollars, which is a drop in the ocean. So what is COP28 going to be doing about that? And also in our region.
And you want an answer in a minute or two?
I'm putting you on the spot, but I mean,
I appreciate
it's still early days, so you can put it on the agenda.
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. So as the COP28 presidency, our role is to facilitate these types of debates. We recognize that among the 190 plus countries, there are 190 plus situations. We have our Chinas and Indias of the world. We have our energy net exporters. We have our energy net importers. So we recognize there is a broad spectrum of issues, not just for the region, but elsewhere. We're looking to be a forum for maximum engagement with every element and every geography of every, so everything from the private sector to the NGOs to the government agencies across the board. We don't prejudge what the answer is going to be to ensure that a consensus is built. Within our area that I'm working in particularly, we are trying to identify private sector solutions to address some of these particular points, particularly how we bring the needs of particular countries to a solution-based scenario that can bridge the technology divide, the financing divide, to allow them to, at a most basic level, have access to energy. We still believe that is the fundamental human right. And that's not going to be taken away because we want to talk about net zero in a country that doesn't have that issue. So Africa is a particularly important constituent. We're engaging heavily with a number of organizations and of course host governments there to talk about the particulars there. Again, even within Africa, there are multiple scenarios everywhere from the north to the south. So there's no straight answer that I can give you, but I can tell you that this COP is committed to identifying actionable and enforceable and verifiable solutions to some of the big issues and to take on some of the topics that perhaps have been shied away from in the past so that we all can deal with this global stocktake that's going to come out, which is going to be, I think, quite transformative because it will really provide a transparent explanation to the world about what we have and haven't been doing right. And we want the private sector to be part of the ownership of the way forward, to be both having their own goals and their own plans, but also to be solution providers and to help drive the agenda on how to make things better. So that's my best answer for that right now.
I'll come back and ask questions to everybody about climate refugees, because I think that is something that's accelerating. Already in 2021, something like 28 million people were displaced internally. We don't know how many got displaced cross-border, but we know it's going to accelerate. So we're going to have to address that. But I want to turn to Laila and ENWWF, because you look at partnerships, you look at initiatives. So what sort of initiatives in terms of climate action are you taking or are on the cards on the road to 2028?
Thank you. Sorry, can you hear me? Perfect. Well, I think we talked about one of our main initiatives in the road up to COP, which is, of course, very much focused around climate mitigation efforts. But the other role that we have is to try and build this dialogue between nature and climate and the fact that both need to be discussed as they're interlinked with one another. So we do have quite a big portfolio of work around nature-based solutions in the UAE. We launched a nature-based solutions project for climate, people, and biodiversity about a year and a half ago. This was supported by HSBC from a funding perspective, and it's in partnership with the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, with ICBA, with the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi. And what we're trying to do with this particular stream of work is we're focusing on priority seascapes, so our coastal landscapes, our blue carbon sinks, if you will, our mangroves, our seagrasses, our mudflats. And we're trying to create measurable outcomes that aim to strengthen climate action. It aims to, again, protect biodiversity, but also bring out those business opportunities for people and nature. So really looking at sustainable blue economy principles as well. And with this stream of work, again, we're aiming to restore and protect and manage priority ecosystems, but the goal is then at COP to showcase models of nature-based solutions, whereby we're piloting technical and commercial feasibility studies on the ground, trying to showcase how blended finance can be unlocked as well towards nature-based solutions, whether they are in the space of ecotourism or food and water security, for example, and then showcase how that can have a long-term goal and a very efficient role as well in building these resilient and sustainable communities, because you're tackling it from a climate mitigation perspective, because again, you're restoring and protecting our carbon sinks. You're tackling it from a climate adaptation perspective as well. And you're looking at the ecosystem services that our natural habitats are providing us as well, beyond acting as carbon sinks. So what is the economic value of that? And that is the role that we're trying to play as an NGO. Again, I think it's important to see that we each have a very unique role, all of us here sitting on the panel as well. And that's where, again, what do we prioritize as our independent organizations? And how do we ensure that our role provides that unique value proposition and complements one another? Because again, we don't have the time, and I think all of us in the room are already starting to feel the burnout and the road up to COP. So it's important to look at what is our specific unique value proposition, how do we focus that, and then how do we join efforts in the long run.
You're pointing to an area which is extremely important, namely investing in climate risk resilient infrastructure. We discussed that a little bit today, whether it's energy infrastructure or other parts. So if I turn to you, Ibrahim, in terms of that, what is it that we should be doing? Because we invest a lot in infrastructure in this region, and we have some quality infrastructure in the GCC. But making it climate risk resilient is a step further. So what should we be doing about that? And what should the private sector be doing about?
As I mentioned earlier, the actions from a perspective of service provider providing services to our clients. Today, in the tendering that is happening on the retrofitting is great. However, we deliver services on the FM business a lot, and we come to our clients and try to convince them that it's not only about maintenance and maintenance costs. Let's look at the energy. So when we approach our clients, existing clients, to convert those contracts from FM to energy, we try to explain that it's not only about cost savings, because the cost saving is mainly the painful for the clients, but look at it from an environmental perspective, and look at it also from the building perspective and the assets that they have, that whenever you do retrofitting, you are extending the life cycle of their equipment. So you are rebuilding the infrastructure in a positive way to make sure that this is sustainable. Yesterday I was meeting a client, and I was very happy when he told me, I want to pay for an energy audit because I need to know what is happening in my facility, and I want to explore more energy saving. So this is the awareness that we started having, honestly, before it was not there. And we are contributing in passing those messages and trying to convince our clients, whether existing or new clients, on approaching the energy business properly, because this is the future and this is what contributes to what the COP28 targets are. So also one of the panel discussions mentioned that there are so many companies that committed on the net zero, like MAF, where they committed on 2040 to reach net zero. Aldar also is implementing. So many of those big players are putting in place this concept. But right now, the other clients should not fear from going into this direction, because there are so many solutions that can be used from an investment point of view. If they have barriers of investing, there are other solutions where ESCO can invest on their behalf, going into a model called shared saving model, or if they have the money, they can go into the guaranteed saving model. So this is how we are trying to promote the energy, part of our business services. And we sensed also from the tenders today that there is no more FM tenders. They are all integrated with energy. They are all putting conditions that if you need to present an offer, you need to consider sustainability part of it and show a commitment on how much you can save part of your operation. So that is, in my opinion, every FM company should think about it in this direction. Because, as we said, AC alone contributes 70% of the energy consumption. So imagine how much the savings you can generate, whether from operations or whether investing in your assets.
I'm conscious of time, so I want to open it up to questions from the floor. So any questions on the road to COP28 to our panel? Can we have a microphone over here? Any other questions while we're preparing the terrain? Yeah, okay. But please, questions, not comments, yeah?
Yeah, quick.
It's on, it's on.
My question is to Sabrin. It's more from the equipment manufacturer's perspective. I'm part of AHRI.
We can't hear you.
This one?
My question is to Samir. So I'm part of AHRI, which is representing air conditioning suppliers and manufacturers, and we as a company also manufacture water heaters, which contributes to about 80% of the building load. So how can we contribute in COP28? Because we have energy efficient products, we also have competitive products which are best in class, but we want to make sure that we have a say in this, in this important conference. And the second thing is we are in MENA region, we're kind of taking baby steps towards, energy transition compared to what's happening in the US. How can this be a quantum jump in which we can straight away bridge the gap and move towards, common?
Thank you. Let me collect another question. There was one over here, and one back there.
Hi, my name is Alan Mamelser, editor, Energy and Utilities. The conference in Egypt last fall, there was some criticism that it turned focus to the so-called reparations or the damage, but then it lost focus on strengthening or focusing more strongly on targets, on emissions reductions targets. So is COP28 going to be conscious of that and maybe trying to overcome that division between the two conversations, or refocusing again on emissions targets?
So Dennis, Samir, do you want to take those two questions?
Sure. So I'll just try to be brief and to the point. So within the energy transition, let's say, partnership group, we have identified sources of energy, users of energy. Cooling is something that we're paying particular attention to. Cooling, heating, it's part of the same. Cooling more relevant in this part of the world, obviously. So we've identified cooling as a strategic area for us to identify what are the challenges, identify how can it be part of the emissions reduction program and ambition. So you'll probably see more on that in the coming, I'd say, months or two. But it's definitely on our radar. So I'll leave that point for there. The second point about how do you scale up on the energy transition. So based on the understanding we have, and so for example, by 2050, the World Energy Council has estimated that the MENA power demand will be over 100% more than it is today. So we just see it as a clear opportunity for the private sector to start filling that gap as we start identifying more robust, clearer targets to be achieved by individual countries. The companies we expect will have a demand side drive to develop both the technologies and the services to meet that demand. So we see that happening just through a market-based process. Clearly there's going to be policy associated with it, but the numbers will speak for themselves. The population's growing and the demand will grow, and then the mix of energy transition technologies will need to be stepped up. So that's the second point. Do you want me to try to address the third point?
Quickly,
yeah. The best I can say is I don't think we're going to mix and match the emissions conversation with the loss and damage. They're both they're individual parts of our platform in terms of pillars. So I think loss and damage is still pretty early in its conversation, but it's definitely now on the agenda. And I think I can't speak to it in more detail, but I can tell you that it is definitely separate from an emissions mitigation type discussion.
Yeah, just to quickly add on emissions, I think it's going to be super hard to steer away from emission conversation this year, factoring that if you take the road from Paris in 2015 towards 2030. So basically in UAE, that's the equator. And factoring the global stocktake that will take place during this COP, that's super hard to steer away from this conversation. So in my opinion, there will be dedicated focus on the emissions specifically.
We had one question over there quickly, but just
Yes,
questions, right? Fast.
I am from esgmena.com. I'm from esgmena.com. My question to Dr. Badr, the honestly speaking, what you mentioned, that's the name of the game in my opinion. How can we entice the private sector to get involved and adopt the ESG basically parameters? We know that the government is very proactive. What about the private sector and the action? This P&L and ROI factor that you mentioned.
Very clear.
How can we entice it?
We had one question over there at the back. Yep, question. But a question, please, no comments at this stage.
Hello, thank you so much for the wonderful comments and a really great opening remark, Dr. Nasser. My question was, for the upcoming COP28, are we exploring any options for pledge taking by big industries and organizations to offer solutions with a circular economy model? So we have panels coming in the market, we have electric fleet coming in the market, but I still see hesitancy from companies when it comes to collection back. And in a span of 20, 30 years, which I think is still a very short span, are we seeing companies take responsibility that we are introducing technology to reduce emissions, but we are also looking at the end cycle and life cycle of these products and technologies?
Okay. Yeah, Nairouz first. Quickly, short answers. Tara.
Simply, I guess that we need to have the collaboration of everybody on the table. So we need the policymakers to implement, if you will, positive and negative implementation if you're doing it right or if you're not doing it right, as well as listening to the whole population. If the private sector is not changing the mindset, there are great implications in terms of losses, like I mentioned, one of which is employer branding. The new leadership, they don't want to work with organizations that they don't have such important element on their priority list.
Just to add, in terms of the collaboration with the private sector, that's basically on the road to COP28. UNDP signed up a few months ago MOU with the CEBC to strengthen specifically cooperation with the clean energy-based companies in the region to address all these challenges that I mentioned before. So I don't sound too negative. I mean, there are challenges, but there are also opportunities for the companies to address them. So that's basically in terms of the partnerships.
So just on this, we're going to aim for COP28 to bring as much of the voice of the private sector within a session or workshop at COP28. So that's a signal to you, Samir. We're going to be approaching you for more voice through the CBC and along with UNDP and others. Laila?
I think just a really quick comment on the circular economy question. I'm currently sitting on the UAE Circular Economy Council, and what the country is focusing on is really creating a very concrete framework around circular economy, and they've rolled out a number of different policies on how circular economy can be integrated across the different industries. For COP28, given its link and alignment as well with the climate discussion and climate agenda, we're also looking at how can we push the agenda further and how can we get more case studies from the private sector showcasing their transformative solutions on this front. So if it's something that you're interested in, then we should definitely connect you to the committee. Thank you.
Right. I think we have, I'm abusing of everybody's time. Just one more question left, I think. There were several, but we'll have time to just, the lady here in front, I think.
Hello, Dennis. The question is really on the SDG impact framework. A lot of talk in the private sector about the ESG, but the United Nations has its own SDG impact framework for the private sector. Do you see the COP28 including such conversation regarding energy projects and large energy programs? And I want to to comment a little bit about the transition fund that UNDP is going to manage in terms of also just and green transition for countries. Thank you.
Any takers on that? Yep.
Yeah, so which transition fund again?
The Green Transition Fund.
In terms of the SDG 7 itself, of course, UNDP, in terms of the strategic approaches, so there are several directions when it comes to SDG 7. In terms of the energy access, there is a commitment to provide energy access to 500 million people up to 2025, accelerate green energy transition, and increase energy efficiency. I mean, in terms of the specific agenda for COP28, I haven't seen it yet. I mean, of course, it's under formation, but I see that that has to be part of the discussion for sure. That's the essence. When we talk about the reduction of emissions, for sure. And I mean, UAE is a perfect place to lead this conversation, factoring all these net zero targets that we've heard before, plus in a country, I mean, the country hosts one of the largest globally renewable energy facilities. So in terms of the private sector engagement, in terms of the policies behind, so that's the question, how this model could be replicated or tailored in other countries in the region.
Right, I think we could go on, but I think we need to end it there, and given everybody's time. But I think one positive message that you should go away with is that COP28 is an excellent opportunity for us, being in the UAE and the region, to express our voice. You know? We know that the technology is there and it's rapidly developing. Lots of innovation in terms of energy, in terms of climate tech, across the board. And we also have financing and resources available. So if it doesn't happen, the fault is with us, not with the absence of resources, technology, or even of vision. So I think we're all certainly very hopeful that COP28 will start giving answers that other COPs did not give. So please join me first in thanking all our panelists for a very engaging discussion. And of course, my invitation to you is that you all become members of the CEBC to continue this discussion on the road to COP28. So thank you very much.